The Chicago sky was bitterly cold, the wind slicing through the deserted streets like a sharpened blade. A man stood hunched before the door of a small diner, his tattered coat hanging in shreds, his hair a tangled mess, his trembling hands clutching his frail frame. His eyes, deep and weary, gazed through the fogged glass where the warm glow of golden lights spilled out. Inside, a young waitress was wiping down tables, her gentle smile a rare ray of sunlight piercing the winter's gloom. The man drew a deep breath, pushed the door open, and was enveloped by the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and rich coffee. Yet, the wary glances from a few diners stopped him in his tracks, a wave of alienation washing over him as if he were an intruder in this cozy haven. The waitress looked up, her eyes meeting his, not with judgment, but with a quiet curiosity. Could kindness alone breach the invisible wall between them? A profound secret lay in wait, ready to be unveiled. Press the subscribe button and ring the bell to ensure you don't miss this heartwarming tale, airing every Wednesday at 8 p.m. on our channel. James eased himself onto the creaky wooden chair at the weathered table nestled in the diner's dimmest corner, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles paling as if to stifle the trembling that seized them. The biting chill of Chicago's streets still lingered, seeping through the threadbare fabric of his tattered coat. But it wasn't the cold that sent shivers through him. It was a deeper, more profound sense of estrangement, a feeling of being unmoored in a world he had once believed he mastered. At 55, James had once held everything dreams are woven from. A grand mansion overlooking the shimmering waters of Lake Michigan, a multi-million-dollar empire built on his ambition, and a small, joyful family whose laughter filled his days. But life, cruel and unrelenting, had struck like a thief in the night, stealing his beloved wife in a devastating accident. That fateful evening, her eyes closed forever, leaving him with their only son, the last ember of hope in his darkening world. Yet even that light was snuffed out. A bitter clash with his 20-year-old son, a young man brimming with fire but burdened by pride, drove an unbridgeable chasm between them. Words, sharp and unforgiving, cut like knives. And when the heavy penthouse door slammed shut, James was left alone, enveloped by a silence that echoed with loss. His lavish home, once a haven, became a frigid mausoleum, every corner whispering of wounds that refused to heal, like scars etched into his very being. On countless sleepless nights, James stood at his penthouse window, staring out at the city's glittering skyline, its lights a mocking contrast to the darkness within him. He questioned whether true kindness still existed, or if the world had devolved into a series of transactions, veiled by greed and self-interest. He had spent too long in a realm of icy handshakes and forced smiles, where every gesture seemed calculated. The doubt gnawed at him, relentless, until it birthed a bold resolve. He would disguise himself as a homeless man, stripping away the trappings of his wealth to peer into the raw heart of humanity. He clothed himself in ragged garments, let his hair grow wild and unkempt, and ventured onto the streets as a man with nothing to his name. This small diner, with its inviting golden lights and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, became the starting point of his quest. He pushed open the door, his heart hammering in his chest, uncertain of what lay ahead but driven by a burning desire to reclaim the faith he had lost, to find a flicker of truth in a world he feared had forsaken it. James's gaze roamed the diner's cozy interior, where patrons laughed and chatted, their voices mingling with the soft clatter of dishes. The scene was warm, alive, but as he settled into his seat, he felt the sting of suspicious glances, as if his presence marred the inviting tableau. He was a blemish, an outsider in this haven of connection. He lowered his eyes, the weight of isolation pressing down, a reminder that he belonged nowhere, not here, not anywhere. Then, a slight figure approached, her steps light yet deliberate, carrying a glass of warm water. Emily, the 24-year-old waitress, moved with a quiet grace, her eyes radiant with a sincerity that seemed to cut through the room's clamor. Behind that warmth, though, lay stories James could only imagine, tales of hardship he would never fully grasp. Emily had grown up in the grip of poverty, once shivering on the same icy Chicago streets James now pretended to call home. She knew the ache of hunger, the cruelty of a world that turned away, the invisibility of being deemed unworthy. This diner job was her salvation, a fragile lifeline, though each grueling 12-hour shift left her feet throbbing and her smile at times a conscious effort to mask her weariness. When Emily's eyes met James's, she saw beyond the ragged clothes and weary exterior. She saw a soul adrift, a mirror of her own past struggles when despair had been her closest companion. Something in his gaze, deep, weighted with a sorrow too heavy for words, tugged at her heart, stirring a quiet empathy. She placed the warm glass before him, its steam rising like a tender offering, a silent gesture of care. Her voice, soft as a spring breeze, asked what he desired, but James could only muster a hoarse mumble, admitting he had no money. Her smile, untouched by judgment or expectation, held steady. She turned away and, moments later, returned with a plate of golden, oven-warm bread and a bowl of soup, its steam curling upward like an invitation to find solace. "On the house, don't worry," she said, her words gentle yet resolute, banishing the doubt that clouded his mind. Her eyes gleamed like stars piercing a midnight sky, carrying a warmth that James had long forgotten, a warmth that felt like home. He stared at the soup, its steam blurring his sight. Or was it the swell of emotions rising within him, threatening to spill over? He grasped the spoon, but his hand trembled, the broth nearly spilling. How long had it been since he had encountered kindness so unblemished, free of strings or conditions? In this guise, cloaked in rags, he had expected scorn, yet here was a meal offered freely, paired with a smile that sought nothing in return. He watched Emily as she moved through the diner, her shoulders slightly slumped from the weight of her long hours, yet her smile unwavering, a beacon of grace amidst the bustle. In that moment, James felt his heart, long encased in the ice of loss, begin to thaw, stirred by the gentle glow of her compassion. He could not yet know that Emily's simple act was unlocking a door within him, one that would lead to answers for the questions that had haunted his sleepless nights, guiding him toward a truth he had almost given up on finding. James clutched the cold metal spoon, his fingers tightening around the handle as if it might slip away, a lifeline in a moment of quiet turmoil. The steam from the steaming bowl of soup rose in delicate tendrils, curling around his weathered face, clouding his vision with its warmth. Or perhaps it was his eyes, misting with tears he had long suppressed, emotions buried beneath years of grief and disillusionment, now stirring restlessly within him. He bowed his head, desperate to hide the trembling that seized his hands, a tremor born not of the Chicago cold but of a heart caught in the grip of something both unfamiliar and hauntingly familiar. It felt as though his very soul was being torn open, exposed to a sensation he had almost forgotten. The touch of kindness, pure and untainted by ulterior motives or expectations. In his ragged, musty clothes, carrying the stale scent of his fabricated days on the streets, he had steeled himself for rejection, harsh words, cold glares, or outright dismissal. Yet before him sat a steaming bowl of soup, its rich aroma mingling with the crisp scent of freshly baked bread, and a smile from the young waitress, a smile that asked for nothing more than for him to eat, to find warmth against the relentless chill of the city's winter. He raised his eyes, his gaze sweeping across the diner's intimate space, where golden light spilled from overhead, casting a soft, embracing glow over the room. Emily, the young woman with her hair pulled high and her apron streaked with the day's work, moved with quiet purpose between the tables. She paused to wipe a spill from a tabletop, her movement steady, and answered a patron's call with a voice that carried a cheerful lilt, though her shoulders bore the subtle sag of exhaustion, as if weighed down by the endless hours of her shifts. James watched her, transfixed, and in that fleeting moment, a question cut through him, sharp and unrelenting as a blade. What compelled someone like her, so clearly without wealth, or the trappings he had once deemed essential, money, status, to offer such generosity without a hint of expectation? He lifted the spoon to his lips, the warm soup gliding down his throat, its heat seeping into his core, as if not merely nourishing his body, but absorbing the essence of Emily's compassion. Each swallow carried a quiet reminder that his heart, hardened and frozen by years of solitude, was beginning to fracture, exposing old scars and the faintest glimmer of hope, fragile yet undeniable. From her post at the cash register in the corner, Emily stole discreet glances at James. Her hands busied themselves folding receipts, but her eyes, soft and perceptive, drifted toward the man seated at the secluded table. Something about him tugged at her, an enigma she couldn't quite unravel. It wasn't his weary posture or the tattered, dust-laden clothes that clung to him, but his eyes, deep and still, like a lake concealing restless currents beneath its surface. She knew that look, had seen it staring back at her from her own reflection in the days when she wandered Chicago's unforgiving streets, when hunger gnawed at her insides and the cold pierced her bones, leaving her feeling abandoned by the world. It was the gaze of a soul adrift, burdened by an invisible weight that defied words. She had no inkling that James was a millionaire, hiding behind a carefully crafted facade to chase answers to questions that haunted him. She only felt the quiet sorrow radiating from him, and that alone was enough to stir a gentle ache in her heart, a call to reach out, to offer solace. Emily approached, a pitcher of water in hand, and refilled James's glass with a care that felt almost instinctive, yet laced with a deliberate tenderness. As she lifted her gaze, her eyes met his, and she offered a faint smile, a small, unassuming gesture, but radiant, like a rare burst of sunlight piercing the heavy gray of a winter sky. In that moment, she hoped her quiet warmth might ease the burden she sensed in him, if only for a fleeting second. She could not know that her simple act was like a stone dropped into a still lake, sending ripples that reverberated through the very foundations of James's world. To him, her smile was more than a kind gesture. It was a vivid testament to the existence of goodness, a beacon that shone even amidst the cold streets and calloused hearts of the city. It whispered that there were still those who extended a hand without agenda, without reason, and that truth shook him to his core. James lowered his head, resuming his meal, but his thoughts drifted far from the soup and bread before him. He saw Emily in his mind's eye, weaving through the diner with a grace and patience that belied the ache she must feel in her feet after hours of tireless work. He thought of himself, a man who had once believed that wealth could command all things, respect, loyalty, even kindness. Now sitting here, utterly humbled by a young woman who had nothing but a heart open to the world. His pulse quickened, each beat a battle between the fragile faith blossoming within him and the gnawing fear that this moment, this feeling, might be nothing more than a fleeting illusion. But as he watched Emily, her smile brightening as she knelt to comfort a child who had dropped a spoon, he knew this was no mirage. Her kindness was real, tangible, and in that quiet diner, under the soft glow of its lights, he felt a delicate light flicker within him, faint, vulnerable, yet strong enough to cut through the darkness that had shrouded his life for far too long. In the days that followed, James found himself drawn back to the small Chicago diner, his boots trudging heavily across the frost-covered sidewalks, the tattered clothes and matted hair still cloaking him in the disguise he had so carefully constructed. But his visits were no longer driven by the simple need for a warm meal or a brief escape from the piercing cold. He returned for Emily, for the warmth in her eyes and the authenticity of her smile, which, like a gentle flame, were beginning to thaw the icy weariness that had settled deep within his soul. He slipped into his usual shadowed corner, the worn wooden table a quiet refuge, and his gaze, deep and searching, followed her every move. He was captivated, trying to decipher what made her different, what allowed a young woman, visibly weighed down by life's struggles, to exude a kindness that burned steadily, like a beacon in the darkest storm. Each time he pushed through the diner's door, Emily welcomed him with a soft, unassuming smile, setting before him a modest plate of warm bread, a steaming mug of coffee, or on occasion, a bowl of soup, its tendrils of steam curling upward like an offering of comfort. He noticed the manager's subtle glances, a silent acknowledgement that Emily sometimes dipped into her own meager earnings to cover these meals, yet she never once made him feel like a burden, her generosity as natural as breathing. James observed Emily's interactions, not just with him, but with every soul who crossed the diner's threshold. She knelt beside a child who had dropped their ice cream, her voice soothing as she wiped the sticky mess from the floor, her smile free of any trace of annoyance. She responded with grace to a surly patron who snapped at her over a lukewarm cup of coffee, her tone gentle yet resolute, unshaken by their bitterness. Her patience and compassion, steady and unrelenting like droplets eroding stone, stirred a quiet shame in James. He, a man who had once commanded luxurious boardrooms, convinced that wealth could purchase anything, loyalty, admiration, even affection, found himself humbled by a young woman who possessed nothing but a heart wide open to the world. Her kindness, intangible and unquantifiable by the metrics of bank accounts, wielded a power that forced him to question his long-held beliefs. He had once seen the world as a place of deceit, populated by those who masked their motives with false smiles, but Emily stood before him as a living contradiction, proof that his cynicism had been misplaced. Yet the more he grew to cherish Emily's presence, the more an unseen burden pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating. The secret of his true self, a millionaire cloaked in rags, a man who had once held everything yet lost what mattered most, grew into an unbearable weight. Each of Emily's smiles, each small act of kindness, deepened the rift within him, tearing him between two agonizing choices: to reveal the truth and risk shattering the fragile bond they shared, or to cling to his deception, basking in the warmth of a kindness he had yearned for so long. He dreaded the thought that if she discovered he was not the homeless wanderer she believed, not the broken soul she saw, her gaze might shift, tinged with suspicion, or worse, disillusionment. Every time he left the diner, stepping into the biting embrace of the night, that secret tightened around him like a noose, stealing the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping for resolution. Emily, for her part, had grown accustomed to James's quiet, steady presence. He rarely spoke, offering little more than a nod of gratitude or a murmured word, but his eyes followed her with an intensity that was neither casual nor intrusive, as if he were searching for something profound, something beyond her grasp. She wondered about the story behind those eyes, about the sorrow that seemed to pool within them, heavy and unspoken, but she held back her questions. She feared that a single misstep, a poorly chosen word, might fracture the delicate thread connecting them. All she knew was that when James left, his footsteps carried a weight, as if the world outside the diner's warm walls was a place he loathed to return to. She felt the loneliness that clung to him, a faint, lingering mist that refused to fade, and it stirred a quiet ache in her own heart. One night, as the diner closed its doors and the streetlights flickered through a thick veil of falling snow, Emily's gaze drifted outside. There stood James, alone beneath the merciless winter sky, his thin frame coatless, his shoulders trembling in the frigid wind, a solitary silhouette against a sleeping world. Without a second thought, she pushed open the door and hurried out, her breath forming fleeting clouds in the icy air. She unwrapped her only wool scarf, a humble relic from her own days of hardship, and gently draped it around his neck. Her hands brushed his shoulders, carrying a warmth born of pure, unspoken care. James lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time, she saw a raw, unguarded vulnerability within them. The fortress he had built, the armor of a man who had once had it all but lost everything, seemed to collapse in that fleeting moment. He spoke no words, but his eyes, shimmering under the faint streetlight, seemed to whisper that her simple gesture had touched a place deep within him, a corner of his soul he had long forgotten existed, now awakened by the quiet power of her compassion. That evening, the small Chicago diner buzzed with life, its air thick with the hum of animated conversations and the rhythmic clinking of plates and silverware. The golden glow of overhead lights bathed the faces of patrons in warmth, their smiles reflecting the comfort of a shared meal. Yet James, as always, withdrew to his familiar sanctuary, a weathered wooden table tucked in the diner's dimmest corner. His tattered clothes, caked with the dust of the streets, clung to him, and a frayed hat cast a shadow over half his face, shielding him from the world he quietly observed. Beneath this disguise, his heart wrestled with a fragile spark of newfound hope and the heavy secret he bore, a truth that gnawed at him with every passing moment. But that night, an unforeseen storm broke over him, shattering the fragile calm he had clung to. A drunken patron, his voice thick and slurred, jabbed a finger toward James, his loud jeers slicing through the din as he branded him a filthy beggar. The words landed like a blade, carving through the room's warmth and silencing the laughter in an instant. Eyes swiveled toward James, some curious, others tinged with pity, but the diner fell into a tense hush, and no one dared speak. James lowered his head, his hands clenching beneath the table, fingers digging into his palms. A wave of shame and isolation crashed over him, as if he were truly the outcast those cruel words declared, a stranger in a place that felt like it could never be his. From behind the counter, Emily, balancing a tray laden with steaming plates, froze mid-step. Her eyes, sharp with resolve, darted toward the scene. She set the tray down with deliberate force, the sharp clatter against the wooden counter echoing like a silent proclamation of her intent. Without a moment's hesitation, she strode forward, her small frame cutting through the crowded room with purpose. She positioned herself in front of James, a steadfast barrier, her presence like a flame that burned bright and unyielding despite the storm around her. Her gaze locked onto the drunken man, unflinching, her eyes cold as the Chicago winter, yet blazing with quiet fury. Her voice, steady and composed, carried a strength that seemed to still the very air, commanding him to apologize. The man scoffed, his mocking tone dripping with disdain, but Emily's unwavering stare bore into him, unshakable. Slowly, his bravado faltered, his arrogance dissolving under the weight of her resolve. He muttered a grudging apology, his words barely audible, before stumbling out into the night, leaving the diner enveloped in an uneasy silence. James remained seated, his heart pounding fiercely, each beat resounding in his chest like a drum. No one had ever defended him, not in this ragged, broken guise, not when he appeared to have nothing to offer. Emily's stand, like a radiant beam slicing through a suffocating darkness, pierced his soul, illuminating a truth he could no longer ignore. He could not continue hiding behind this lie. As the night wore on, the diner gradually emptied, its warm lights fading to a soft glow, the clamor of voices dissolving into a profound stillness. James lingered, his resolve hardening, and he called Emily to a quiet corner near a frost-kissed window. His hands trembled as he reached for his tattered hat, pulling it away to reveal a face cleaner than she had ever seen, free of the grime that had masked him. His eyes, deep and shimmering with raw emotion, met hers, as if he were not merely removing a hat, but dismantling the walls he had built around his wounded heart. In a voice thick with feeling, he began to unveil his truth. He was no homeless wanderer, but a millionaire, a man who had once held the world in his hands only to lose what truly mattered, his beloved wife stolen by a tragic accident, and his only son, driven away by a bitter argument that left wounds too deep to heal. He spoke of the crushing loneliness that had propelled him into this journey, cloaking himself in rags to seek out the kindness he feared had vanished from the world, to find something, anything, worth clinging to. Each word he uttered was a jagged edge, cutting into himself, a painful release that set him free even as it tore at his soul. Emily stood before him, listening intently, her eyes wide, not with astonishment at his wealth, but with a profound empathy for the anguish he carried. In James, she saw neither a millionaire nor a homeless man, but a fellow soul adrift, much like she had been during her own desolate days on the streets, when hope seemed a cruel illusion. She harbored no resentment for his deception, no sting of betrayal. When his voice fell silent, she spoke, her words soft as a winter breeze, carrying a quiet strength. She told him that, regardless of who he was, she only wished for him to know that there were still people in this world who gave without expecting reward. Her words, simple yet woven with sincerity, wrapped around James like an unseen embrace, soothing the scars he had borne for so long. In that fleeting moment, under the dim light of the diner, he felt his journey reach its close. The restless search for meaning had found its anchor in the gentle, unwavering compassions of this young woman whose courage and kindness had shown him a world still worth believing in. James stepped out of the diner that night, a light snowfall dusting his shoulders, but the Chicago cold no longer made him shiver. His heart, for the first time in years, felt unburdened, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. The secret of his true identity, which had once pressed against his chest like a heavy stone, was now set free. He no longer needed the tattered clothes or the haggard appearance to conceal himself. The homeless disguise, once a tool to test the world's kindness, had become a distant memory. Yet, as he walked down the quiet street, the soft glow of streetlights casting shadows around him, James knew his journey was not truly over. Emily's kindness, like a small but fierce flame, had ignited in him a belief that this world still held things worth hoping for. He wanted to do something, not just to repay her, but to keep that flame spreading. Weeks later, James returned to the diner, but this time he was no longer the silent man in the corner. He stepped inside wearing a pristine suit, his hair neatly combed, his face clean, and his eyes alight with a spark of determination. The diner remained unchanged, its warm golden lights and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread filling the air. But now James felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. Emily stood behind the counter, wiping glasses with familiar motions, a gentle smile on her lips, despite the slight slump of her shoulders from fatigue. When she looked up and saw James, her eyes flickered over him, a hint of surprise at his transformation, but her innate sincerity remained. James approached, his hands tightly clutching a white envelope, his heart pounding as if trying to speak the words he had never dared to express. He placed the envelope before Emily, his gaze locked on her, filled with profound gratitude. Inside was a full scholarship to a prestigious university, an opportunity he knew could transform her life, just as she had transformed his. He spoke softly, his voice low but steady, saying she had given him faith in human kindness, and now he wanted to offer her a chance to shine. Emily stood there, her hands pausing on the glass, her eyes widening, not at the gift's value but at the meaning behind it. For the first time, she, a young woman who always found a way to smile through hardship, was at a loss for words. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around James in a tight embrace, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from a simple, profound joy. In that embrace, they both felt a connection that transcended all boundaries, an invisible thread woven from kindness and understanding. James didn't stop there. The change within him, sparked by Emily, drove him to seek out the son he had lost. Reconciling with the 20-year-old who had left him after bitter words was no easy task. Old wounds lingered, but James now carried a new hope. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he had found the light to guide his steps, and it all began with a young waitress and a free meal in a small diner. The story of James and Emily is a reminder that kindness, however small, holds the power to change an entire life. Out there, amidst the frigid streets and hardened hearts, there are still people ready to extend a hand without expecting anything in return. Emily's compassion, like a stone cast into a still lake, created ripples that touch not only James, but also those who hear this story. Share this tale to spread the message of kindness, like a flame warming the coldest winter days. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, where inspiring stories are shared every Wednesday at 8 p.m. So together, we can make this world a little warmer, one step at a time.